Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Around the Big Ten podcast. I'm Mark Givler, joined by Chip Minnick, as always. Our pre-spring looks around the Big Ten at all 18 teams continue. We are on the national champion winning Ohio State Buckeyes. Quite a roller coaster ride in 2024 if you're an Ohio State fan. Maybe the lowest of lows to the highest of highs in what, 2 months, less than 2 months. I think everyone was kind of leaving him for dead. Ryan Day was a dead man walking. Everything else after the Michigan game, they rally and put together a pretty dominant playoff performance throughout and win the national championship. And now, it's Columbus, Ohio. So the expectations from the fan base are, okay, now what are you going to do this spring so that we do this all again next year? Right? That's what they're saying. So never an off year, never a rebuilding year for the Buckeyes, or at least the fans will not allow you to do that. So let's dive into this, because there is a lot to talk about with Ohio State. It's like, look, talk about staff shakeup. 2 new coordinators, new position coaches, just a lot going on with their coaching staff, Chip. Again, how Matt Patricia hire is wild. That's going to be like fascinating to watch. 2 new, got a new offensive line coach, new quarterbacks coach, elevating Brian Hartline. They've brought in a bunch of support staff guys as well. How does this come together, Chip, and how quickly can it come together? Because again, they play Texas. Week 1. Like, this does not, like, you don't ease into this with 4 MAC schools.
No, you don't ease into it. And I freely admit, as I sit here thinking about, like, as you referred to it, Mark, the roller coaster, it's aptly put. But it is great to be talking about the national champion as a lifelong Ohioan, and I the proud parent of an Ohio State graduate, as well as my son is going to be attending Ohio State this coming fall. Like, to try to impress upon my children that, okay, like 3 national championships since 2002. That is not something that growing up as an Ohio State fan that I had grown accustomed to. So I don't want to ever take it for granted. But you're right. I mean, Ohio State fans are a demanding bunch. There is no letdown. There is no, that you can take a step back. There is going to be the expectation that Ohio State can be in the contention for another national championship. And I think Ryan Day is right to, the way that he concluded the national championship celebration, let's go get another one. I think, he has the right mindset, but getting the coaches assimilated into the Ohio State program is going to be easier said than done. I think that for some of them, the fact that, as you mentioned, some of them were internal promotions. So Brian Hartline, very familiar with the expectations that Ryan Day has for the offense. I think when it comes to Keenan Bailey, he's another guy that was promoted. But in terms of, how much of a role he will have in the offensive coordination, even though he has that co next to in his title, we'll see. I think it's going to be extremely important to find out what the visions Matt Patricia has for the defense. I'm not suggesting that he needs to come in and say that, we're not going to change anything that Jim Knowles did. But I think respecting what worked, we talk about the idea of, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, like, there were a lot of things that worked on that Ohio State defense. So if I'm Matt Patricia, I'm going to be coming in somewhat, I don't want to say humble, but somewhat respectful of what the Ohio State defense accomplished, and say, here's what we did in New England that we believe can enhance the Ohio State defensive experience. And then as far as Tyler Bowen, better than anybody that one of the criticisms that Justin Fry had was on the recruiting front. All indications are that Tyler Bowen has hit the ground running, flooding the scholarship offers for offensive linemen, but he's going to need to develop an offensive line that is losing. We had already grown accustomed to, unfortunately, Josh Simmons being out of the starting lineup, but Donovan Jackson, Seth McLaughlin, and Josh Fryer. Let's not ignore the fact that Josh Fryer. So Fortunately for Ohio State that they rotated a lot of players in, but getting that offensive line to be a cohesive unit, that's going to be something that understandably that Ohio State fans are going to be keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, there's like so many subplots to this topic of getting the new coaches assimilated. I mean, and again, like luckily you kept most of your offensive staff intact, or at least most of your offensive staff was there last year. So like Billy Fessler, the new quarterbacks coach, was there last year. Ryan Day, offensive guy, quarterbacks guy. Brian Hartline was there, of course. Keenan Bailey, their new co-OC, there as the tight ends coach. So like they've got guys who have been around the program. Like Keenan Bailey, it's hilarious. Keenan Bailey's like their second longest tenured coach after Larry Johnson.
Right.
Like people don't realize that because he's still so young, but he's been there like a really long, like in coach years, he's been there forever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's coaches in this time since Keenan Bailey was like their QC guy to now, there's probably coaches out there who've had 6 or 7 different jobs, like, so like different schools. So like, he's been there a while. But this is all like total wild card stuff. And I know people are going to say, take that word as derogatory or negative. It doesn't have to be. Just because something's a wild card, just because something is really hard to predict, doesn't mean it's going to turn out badly. This may turn out amazingly, but there's a lot of unknown here. You've got a first-time play caller, an offensive coordinator. You know, you've got a new quarterbacks coach who's got to work in tandem with Ryan Day, who luckily for Ohio State has been around the program though. And then Keenan Bailey's going to get more and more involved in game planning as a co-OC. And then you've got the new O-line coach, who reputation is good recruiter. They've had basically 4 non-recruiters at offensive line coach in a row in Columbus, if you go back. Mm-hmm. So like expectations are going to be high on Tyler Bowden to come in and immediately improve the offensive line recruiting. And oh, by the way, he's got to, as you mentioned, he's got to put together a new offensive line. And oh, by the way, Billy Fessler gets to manage a quarterback competition that we all think Julian Sayin is going to probably win, that we all think he's well ahead coming into the spring. But even if it's that, like, even if Julian Sayin is clearly going to be their guy, this is a guy who's barely played. He's a redshirt freshman. Like, you've got to get him ready to play Texas at the end of August. Like, he doesn't get to play, Akron or Kent State week 1. And then you get him, you play 4 cupcakes and then you just get him ready for October. Like, he's got to come out and play Arch Manning in Texas week 1. And a very good Texas secondary that, quite frankly, I was just at the combine. Many people think might be the best secondary in the country next year. I would argue Ohio State probably thinks their secondary might be the best secondary in the country next year too. So we'll find that out in August. But that's no small task for Billy Fessler. Again, luckily he'll be insulated a bit by Ryan Day and his input and his background as a very successful quarterbacks guy. But there's a lot to process here. And for me, as I've said this before, like Matt Patricia, really out of the box hire, almost Nick Saban-esque in terms of like rehabbing a guy for a year or two and then probably sending him off somewhere, to the NFL, back to the NFL. I've kind of been on record as saying, like, I think Matt Patricia's hire, I don't think we're going to sit back and look at Matt Patricia's hire in like 5 or 6 years and say, oh, that was just fine. Like, I think it's going to be wildly successful or wildly not. Like, I don't know that we're going to find this middle ground with him of, oh, that was, they got through it. It was okay. It wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. Like, I feel like it's going to go one direction or the other with Patricia. Am I being too reactionary to that?
No, you're not. And okay, as Ohio State fans, we've seen some great hires. Jeff Hafley was on that first Ryan Day staff, and we've seen the Kerry Combs hire blow up in our respective faces. And so we have every, I don't want to say justifiable, because I don't think any Ohio State fan, can honestly say that they are justified in the way that they handle Ohio State football news. But it's certainly understandable that Ohio State fans are going to be looking at Matt Patricia with a lot of trepidation, simply because of the way that, the way it wound up in Detroit was just a complete unmitigated disaster. And anyone who tries to sugarcoat it, I mean, they're really trying to sell you something that you want no part of. And then when you take a step back further and say, all right, well, he was on the staff with New England, and I realize this is going to sound like a shot at Matt Patricia. How much credit, and this is something that, you referenced, for example, like Nick Saban, how much credit do you give Matt Patricia when he was on Bill Belichick's staff? That was kind of like Nick Saban, the fact that he was a defensive minded guy as the head coach at Alabama. That was always kind of like, okay, well, the defensive coordinator at Alabama, how much are they really in charge there with Nick Saban overseeing everything? So Matt Patricia is going to be looked at with understandable suspicion, and especially if he comes in and as I said earlier, if he comes in and tries to completely undo everything that Jim Knowles built arguably the statistically the best defense in college football last year. If he tries to upend it in this spring and summer, Ohio State fans are going to be ready to pounce at the first sign of adversity, which may come against Texas in the season opener.
Yeah. And so I feel like my previous segment here was a little bit glass half empty. So I'll give you the glass half full now. I'll give you both sides of this. If you do the Ryan Day scouting report, what is one of the big things you put on his list of positives? For me, one of the things on his list of positives on his scouting report would be that's a pretty high percentage, pretty high batting average on his coaching hires. Mm-hmm. Nobody bats 1,000 on this. Like Nick Saban's made disaster hire. Like everyone has made a disaster hire or two that's been a head coach for a while, but nailed a coordinator, his defensive coordinator hire, his offensive coordinator hire, Chip Kelly. No one will admit this now. When he promoted Brian Hartline, people were losing their minds. He's never done this. Why would we? We're Ohio State. We don't promote within. We can go get any receiver coach in the country. Why would we do this? And no one's going to admit they said that now, but that was 1,000% a talking point when he did that. So he saw something there. He's seen things in Keenan Bailey that people got mad about Keenan Bailey. Keenan Bailey's been a great tight ends coach for them. Like, has been a great assistant coach for them. Like, there are a lot of things. James Laurinaitis completely revamped. Their linebacker room was terrible a few years ago. Terrible. Moved Cade Stover to play linebacker in the freaking Rose Bowl. Terrible. James Laurinaitis has just huge influx of talent there. So, like, the one thing Ryan Day, to me, has consistently done well is put his staffs together. So they've got that. The other thing that I like about this is there is quite a bit of continuity on both sides. Like we're talking about like all these, there's like new roles, but there is still a lot of continuity. Like Matt Patricia is going to have James Laurinaitis, Larry Johnson, and most importantly, Tim Walton and Matt Guerrieri in his inner circle here. Like these are guys who have either been here through a lot of success, or Tim Walton's his ties to Ohio State. Larry Johnson's the longest tenured coach on the staff. James Laurinaitis, does anyone bleed scarlet and gray more than James Laurinaitis? Like he's got a lot of people, I think, around him who have enough cachet to check him, even though he's the DC, if like things are not going the way they need to be going. So I think they can pull this off. Like, no, it's not going to be just flawless or seamless. There's going to be some bumpy parts of this process at points, but Brian Hartline hasn't failed yet as an assistant coach. Like they brought him in as a QC, was fantastic. Like 2 years before they hired him as a receivers coach, that was all anyone would talk. You would talk about, you would ask anyone at Ohio State about Brian Hartline, and they would tell you he's got a very bright future in this. And that came to fruition. So he worked his way up. Receivers became the best receivers coach in the country. Still, probably one of the maybe the best recruiter in the country. So he hasn't failed yet. And if you didn't promote him, you were going to probably have to watch him go somewhere else and be a coordinator. Like, would that be worth the risk? Personally, I don't think so. As someone who thought they would hire outside, I looking back on it, I'm like, you know what? This probably had to happen. I didn't, at the time, you didn't really realize. I think that Brian Hartline was so interested in being a coordinator. Like he would always, you never quite got a feel for like his desire to move up. Like how far does he actually want to move up? Well, it became very clear apparently that he does want to be a coordinator. And so again, he hasn't failed at anything he's tried to do. Right. I mean, and that goes all the way back to high school. He's a 3-star recruit who had a long NFL career. So
if anything, just to kind of piggyback off what you said, because just to kind of push the glass beyond half full, I'm going to push it a little beyond that. And one of the things that I truly respect about Ryan Day, and it kind of goes along the lines of his coaching hires, is Ryan Day, and I think that this is an admirable trait. He's decisive. There is no wishy-washy with Ryan Day. Say what you will about, I can't believe we lost to that team, up north again. Okay, I hear you loud and clear. I heard you, like my late father used to say, I heard you twice the first time. Okay. Now, when it comes to being decisive, I'm going to kind of dip back into what I just talked about. When things are not working out, Ryan Day is not averse to pulling the plug. As much as I loved the enthusiasm of Kerry Combs, when it was not working out, he did not, worry about her. And I realized that it probably was just very jarring to Kerry Combs, but all right, we can't have you as the coordinator anymore. And he was demoted, and Kerry Combs, to his credit, rode out the storm, moved on. And that's when we brought in Jim Knowles. When it came to the offensive line, the recruiting was suffering. And I agree with you that, it's been more than a minute that offensive line recruiting has the last several coaches have struggled in that endeavor. And I don't believe that Justin Fry was in danger of losing his job, but I just believe that he took an opportunity that he felt was best suited for him. But they brought in a guy that, with Tyler Bowen, who, like I said earlier, he hit the ground running. So I truly believe, to kind of, push that glass beyond the half full, I'm going to add to it. I think that in my estimation, that positive quality of being decisive is something that has me very optimistic about the new coaches assimilating into the Ohio State football program.
Yeah, Justin Fry, very well-respected offensive line coach, did a great job with the offensive line at Ohio State this past year. I think the NFL makes sense for him, though. Just not a guy who really loves recruiting. Right. Just loves kind of coaching offensive line. So that's perfect. Chip Kelly, kind of the same thing. And that kind of brings us into this other, you've got this coaching shakeup. There's 15 Ohio State Buckeyes at the NFL Combine. Got a lot of talent to replace.
Yes.
They got a lot of talent to replace, but more so than that, got a lot of leadership to replace. Will Howard, Jack Sawyer, these are big-time leaders, just beyond just their ability to play on the field. Emeka Egbuka. Just so many leaders they lost. How do they replace that leadership? Where is that leadership going to come from?
Well, one guy that I think, and I apologize if this comes across as just blatantly obvious, but I think Caleb Downs on the defensive side. I mean, I will be tremendously surprised if Caleb Downs does not emerge as an elected captain. Just because his talent in the secondary, but I think he, in my estimation, he kind of demonstrated leadership already as a transfer last year. His play on the field was evident for Ohio State. So I would think that Caleb Downs would be certainly one a name to be keeping an eye out and an ear out for. Sonny Styles is probably, this is not necessarily the most difficult thing, but I'd be surprised if Sonny Styles is not wearing the Block O come next summer. I think that he's certainly a prime candidate for that. And then on the offensive side, with, like you said, it's like, I think, you usually expect, your quarterback, you referenced Will Howard to be a leader. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out with the quarterback competition. I'm going to throw out a couple names that might surprise and maybe out of left field. I think Carson Hinsman, the roller coaster that he's been on, I think that he's kind of starting to emerge as on that offensive line as a guy that, you can look at to kind of, as the offense with the new offensive line coach, the new quarterback, the new running backs, the fact that, I think Carson Hinsman and I'm going to say Luke Montgomery as well. I think Luke Montgomery is one of these that he's one of these guys that, the latter part of the year, his maturity allowed him to get into the starting offensive line. And I believe that there's still going to be some kind of a rotation there, but those would be my picks going into the spring about potential leaders for the 2025 team.
Yeah, I thought I was going to get away with two guys you didn't mention. I'm only going to get away with one.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. We'll start with the defense. They lose 8 starters. They have 3 back. That being said, we'll go glass half full here because I think this is legit. The 3 guys they have coming back are probably their emotional leaders on defense, other than maybe Jack Sawyer. And these were guys who were very vocal last year. Sonny Styles, Davison Igbinosun, and Caleb Downs. All 3 of those guys play with a ton of energy and fire, so I think they're going to be okay on defense with that. My only concern, if there is one on the leadership aspect, is I don't view Julian Sayin. I haven't seen it yet from Julian Sayin or Lincoln Kienholz. And I don't mean that in of course they haven't played. I mean that in practice. I mean that in watching, kind of getting a feel for their demeanors and interviews in high school, everything else. Neither of them strike me as Will Howard, fiery guys. Now, I don't worry about that too much. Some people it bothers. It bothered a lot of people that CJ Stroud wasn't a screamer and a yeller, which I always thought was kind of ridiculous, but that it's going to have to probably be that type of lead by example stuff. I don't know if they're going to get it from the quarterback this year. I just, maybe Julian Sayin's a young guy. Maybe that comes out of him. Because sometimes it does. Sometimes these guys come in as freshmen and they're just trying to stay below the radar and do their job and learn everything. And it gradually comes out of them, and maybe that'll happen. But it's not something that I think comes naturally to either of them. That being said, I'll throw out 2 names on offense that I think it does come very naturally for. One of them, as you mentioned, is Luke Montgomery, who, they'll rotate, but the way he played down the stretch, I don't think there's any way he's not starting. Probably at right guard, but definitely at somewhere on the offensive line. And the other guy who has, even as a backup, has never shied away from is Brandon Inniss. I think Brandon Inniss, he's fiery. He brings great energy to practice. And he's also kind of embraced the mentorship role of young receivers on the roster. Even though he was only a sophomore this year, he embraced mentoring the freshmen and will continue to do that. So I think those 2 guys are going to provide a lot of leadership for the offense. So I think the candidates are definitely there despite all the losses to the NFL. I think the candidates are absolutely there. So last thing here, and we talked about a little bit with the first thing on the coaching shakeup, but they got to replace 2 offensive tackles.
Mm-hmm.
They've gone to the portal for Phillip Daniels, a very talented right tackle out of Minnesota, who will be a redshirt sophomore this year. Started the last 4 games at Minnesota this year as a redshirt freshman. And then they go take Ethan Onianwa from Rice, who was one of the higher rated guys in the portal. They've got to reshuffle this line. You're losing you got 2 open tackle spots, your center, which I think is an easy fix, but your center's gone. And then ultimate, jack of all trades, Donovan Jackson, also gone. How quickly can they do this? Because again, if you're piecing things together in fall camp and you play Texas, you really need to break spring with a really good idea of this is probably our starting 5. Do we have 6 guys that can play? Do we have 8 guys that can play? Are we in deep trouble if anyone gets injured? They've got to come out of this with a lot of answers on the offensive line, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of excited. I'd be lying if I didn't tell you about just seeing Onianwa and Daniels, simply because everything that I've heard and read behind the scenes, that they were there at the Ohio State practices as the transfer portal additions, even though they didn't participate in the college football playoff, that these guys are just massive. I mean, that they were just like physically massive. And that's not a shot at the players that were on the offensive line last year. But I think that it'll be interesting to see. Now, Daniels, I think is probably more raw, that, the fact that he's coming from Minnesota, he only started the latter portion of the season for the Gophers last year. I think he's a likely candidate for the right tackle, Onyanwa on the left side. And then, like you said, it's like they've got a nucleus of returning interior offensive linemen. How that all shapes out is going to be crucial. And I'm going to throw a name out there that you probably know far better than a lot of our.
You're take it from me again, aren't you? Go ahead.
Ian Moore. I'm sorry. I'm not. I will say this. I will say this. We don't script this, but it's like what I'm excited about is that Ian Moore is one of these guys who was highly recruited, chose Ohio State. It wouldn't have surprised me. I will say this. You want to talk about not scripted? When everything happened last year, and all of a sudden that Zen Michalski went down, and okay, what are we going to do now? And it seemed logical, which is the way it wound up, that Donovan Jackson moving him out to left tackle, and it worked out tremendously for Ohio State. But it wouldn't have surprised me if they had given Ian Moore a shot, just simply because the high accolades that he had coming out of high school. So I think if Ian Moore in his development, if he can be one of those guys, especially at that left tackle position, not to make it a controversial thing, but like to give him some reps there so that he's ready to go in the event that Onyanwa, needs a breather, injury, God forbid. And then another one from my neck of the woods up here in the northeastern Ohio area. I think he's a little behind in terms of just his development. But the Armstrongs, I think that, they're coming out of a powerhouse program in Lakewood St. Ed. So it's like if their development physically, if they can become part of that rotation, that'd just be tremendous for the entire offensive line.
Yeah, I just want to be obnoxious one last time on Philip Daniels. 3 years ago, I said they should have offered him. I saw him at camp. He came to their camp. He had, maybe half a dozen offers. It was like Minnesota and Louisville, and I don't know if Kentucky had offered him or not. They offer everybody, so they probably did. And I thought he looked absolutely tremendous at camp. I think Justin Fry thought he was a little too raw. I'm not sure why they didn't offer him out of high school. And the other thing at that point is they got into this habit a little bit too much with the offensive line at times. Is they also had a couple of higher rated guys that they were chasing. They didn't get them. And so Philip Daniels, to me, it would not shock me to see Philip Daniels take the Josh Simmons career path, which is everyone just doesn't really realize how big of a pickup this is going to be until 2 years later when he's in the NFL. I really think this is a big pickup long term. Will he be ready to go and be one of the best linemen in the fall of this year? That's yet to be determined, but upside, tremendous upside. But Ian Moore is the key to this. They've cross-trained him at both left and right tackle and have been since the moment he arrived on campus. So you can have this three-man tackle tandem. They had this at guard last year, and it worked out really well by the end of the year. And so you can maneuver the pieces a little bit here. And so what does that look like? Is it Onyanwa at left, Daniels at right, and then Moore's your guy who just jumps in for either one of them and rotates in? Or does Ian Moore beat out Philip Daniels at right tackle? And Daniels is the guy who's got to kind of rotate in. I mean, I think that's going to be a legitimate competition. As much as I love Philip Daniels, I'm not writing off Ian Moore. I think they're going to make those guys compete, but it does to get to my point is it drives competition. Ian Moore is the key to driving competition, or else you're just bringing in two guys who are going to get no push because Zen Michalski's gone and George Fitzpatrick, who you thought was going to be a depth tackle for you, went to the portal, and you're left, with not a lot. Now Deontay Armstrong in his development is going to be key as well. So I think you've got enough depth there if you don't get any unlucky injuries. But yeah, they've got to piece that together. I'm not worried about the interior. It's going to be Hinsman at center. Probably it's going to be like Hinsman center, Sierreveld left guard, Montgomery right guard. Like I'm willing to like die on that hill already that's what it's going to look like. And then it's going to be up to the rest of the offensive linemen to force their way into a rotation there. But I think they have a little more playable depth at tackle this year.
And
last year, but so you don't count Donovan Jackson into your tackle depth because you don't think it's ever going to come to that. But like in terms of like pure tackles, I do think they have a little bit more playable depth this year.
And let's not ignore the fact, and I realize that he has to be further down on the depth chart just as a true freshman, but Carter Lowe, as now granted, he is a true freshman. And I remember when it came to Michael Jordan starting on the offensive line as a true freshman, Urban Meyer kind of saying like that is a bad side, even though he was starting for his team. It was basically an indictment of the returning talent and the lack of depth and the lack of development. But getting to my point that I think, Carter Lowe, if he can be cross-trained in the same manner and fashion as you referenced with Ian Moore, I think that's just another thing to be optimistic about for the Ohio State offensive line beyond the 2025 season.
Big Carter Lowe fan. So I agree with you. I think they will do that. And then it's like, okay, like looking forward, like how do you set this up? Again, is like Ian Moore the backup? It's probably your backup tackle at both spots if something happens. I mean, now when you run the twos, you'll have to put another tackle out there. So I'm guessing it'll be like Ian Moore or Philip Daniels running with Deontay Armstrong would be my guess, with right. Carter Lowe behind them as like the fifth tackle basically. And so I think this is a good position for Carter Lowe to be in, where I think they can get him into some games this year. They can probably keep his red shirt.
Yep.
I'm not a red shirt guy except for offensive linemen. It's
exactly.
The only place I'm for red shirts. So I think he's in a good spot I think he's in a good spot in terms of, I think they'd have to have a couple of injuries for him to be thrust into any type of high leverage situation. So I think he'll be able to develop well, very high on him, very high on his abilities long-term. But you're right. I agree that's a nice kind of ace in the hole there, is to have a very highly rated tackle like him coming in to provide you even more depth there at tackle. But I think it's gonna be interesting. I think it's gonna be an interesting battle. And I know I referenced like right tackle with Daniels and Moore. They're not gonna just give it to Onyanwa either. I mean, so it's gonna be. I think that's gonna be an interesting thing to watch though this spring, is kind of who's pushing for time, how close are these battles at tackle. Because I think a lot of their stars from last year that are back are going to get a lot of time off this spring. I don't think Jeremiah Smith's going to be doing too much. I don't think like Carson Hinsman's going to be doing all that much. I don't, there's a lot. Probably Carnell Tate's going to have some bubble wrap on him. Caleb Downs is going to have bubble wrap, but there's going to be some of these things with these transfers and these young guys like, hey, you guys haven't been through this yet as starters or even in this program at all. In some cases, we're going to push you guys. And, again, Caleb will see you in August, but so that's going to be very interesting to me, because I do think they'll push this offensive tackle spot a little bit in the spring.
Absolutely.
All right. We have wrapped this up. I think that was a long time to talk about three things. I think we got.
let's be fair to our audience. Okay. We're talking about the program that we know most, I'd like to believe that we're most familiar with. I mean, when it comes to, like the Big Ten, we have, again, like kind of from the outside looking in, like what we believe are the pressing issues. But when it comes to Ohio State, obviously, I continue to, always try to point out, like your knowledge of like the ins and outs of what's going on with Ohio State recruiting. Behind the scenes what is happening and kind of who they're targeting and all that, as well as like the moves with the coaches. I think that it kind of lent itself for us going a little bit longer than we normally would on any of the other Big Ten programs.
Yeah, look, it's a team that just won the national championship and then sent
right.
15 guys to the NFL Combine. There are a lot of questions. I mean, there's a
Exactly.
lot of there's a lot, and then just has 2 new coordinators. So like,
Yeah.
there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to unpack. It's gonna be a very interesting spring in Columbus. I'm sure, like I said, Ohio State fans will be all over it. They start on the 17th. St. Patrick's Day. I couldn't remember if it was 16th or 17th. I was like,
yeah, it was. Yeah. So it's so strange to think about how, it's just one of those things where, again, I say it with a smile on my face, the defending national champions, but it's like, okay, it's strange to be thinking about, like, okay, you're moving forward into 2025 because the 2024 national championship game was just at the end of January. So it's like
6 weeks ago.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So life comes at you fast.
Yes, it does.
Thanks, everyone. Again, if you're watching this on Saturday Glory's youtube.com / Saturday Glory, you can watch all of the Big Ten capsules we did, pre-spring questions on all 18 teams in the Around the Big Ten playlist, or you can download the Around the Big Ten podcast on any audio platform of choice. But we appreciate everyone's support, appreciate everyone watching and listening. Let us know what your big questions are for Ohio State in the comments, what you want to see this spring, what you're hoping to learn about the team. But we will let everyone go now and appreciate it. We'll be back in a few days with another episode, but we'll catch you next time.